Now, the new government has announced plans to move power out of Westminster and into the hands of local people.
Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner, who's also Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government, says that opportunities for many towns and cities have been controlled by Westminster for too long. Angela Rayner joins us now, live from Westminster. Good morning to you. What kind of powers are we talking about then that you're going to hand away from where you are now and hand out to councils and mayors across the country?
Well, first of all, this is an opportunity for those councils that haven't had a devolution package to really get on board, and I hope that they'll take up that offer and we can devolve things like skills, housing, planning and employment support to really kickstart what's happening in their local area. As the Prime Minister set out, those with skin in the game are at the forefront of really making the change, and for us to get that growth across the whole of the country, we know that we have to work in partnership with local authorities, with mayors, and to really kickstart our economy everywhere.
That's interesting you say local authorities and with mayors, because I think some people probably saw last week the directly elected Metro mayors taking selfies in Downing Street and thought, well, I don't have a mayor in my area, so how does my council, my area, fit into this? But you say that those councils that don't have mayors will also be included in your plans.
Absolutely, and I've wrote to those council leaders today to ask them to come on board, and you'll have noticed that I changed the department name to put local government right at the heart of it again. You know, these are local authorities provide some of the most critical services to people every single day, and I recognise that. I recognise the challenge that they've faced over the last 14 years, and that's why I want to put them on stable footing for the future and really bring them around the table to tackle some of the inequalities and the things that are holding them back.
And yet, the new Chancellor, your colleague Rachel Reeves, said last week that as part of her plans for growth and building, that planning decisions for major infrastructure projects in Britain will be made nationally now rather than locally. That doesn't sound like devolution. That sounds like the opposite of devolution.
Well, look, planning, whether it's our national infrastructure planning, will always have a local element to it where they will make the first decisions. I've set out that I want local mandatory targets again. I think that's important so that there is skin in the game again, that they're making decisions. But we can't have major infrastructure programmes being held up at a local planning level. And the Chancellor also set out the 400 new planners that we will put on board and a task force to support us in making sure we do communicate with local authorities and local communities to get our national infrastructure kick-started. At the moment, people are waiting up to 7, 8, 9, 10 years for planning of national, interest to get underway, and that's slowing down growth. And we've seen that that's having a negative impact, not just on our GDP and what the country can provide, but on local communities as well and our public services. So we have to get growth, and if we'd have grown at the average rate of the OECD countries, we'd have had over £140 billion more in our economy that would have helped towards that spending on our public services. OK,
but you see what I mean? You're saying councils, mayors have extra powers. Rachel Reeves is saying, but when it really counts on these big projects for planning, we in London will decide.
Well, that's not the case, because we'll continue to consult them, but we can't have big infrastructure projects being held back. And that's why, the Chancellor also announced that I was looking at some of the stalled sites that we'd seen, and we were unlocking them within the first couple of days and giving them the go-ahead, because we have to get Britain building if we want growth, and we're being very upfront about that. And I think we got a clear mandate, not only for devolution, which I've set out today, but also about making sure that we get the growth in those homes that people desperately need, and that infrastructure and jobs that people want to see in Britain going forward.
Just a few minutes ago here on Breakfast, we heard from a charity who are delivering beds to children, to families where the kids don't have beds. And we had a statistic that almost 1 million children across the UK last night won't have had their own bed to sleep on. At the same time, some of those families who have more than 2 children can no longer claim universal credit for a third child or more, can't claim child tax credits, and they're looking to you as a new Labour government to lift that cap. Why won't you do it?
Well, first of all, we're going to be reviewing universal credit, and I think that's important. Secondly, we've got a child poverty strategy, which it's not just one lever. I accept that people are frustrated around the 2-child cap, but there is only... That people are frustrated, and they're frustrated over 14 years. We've had 14 years of the Tories who have put us on the highest tax burden for 70 years and the lowest growth. So that's why growth is imperative to us, so that we can afford to spend on making sure we can lift children out of poverty. I've set out the New Deal for working people, which is about making work pay, so people have secure jobs. We'll lift 1 million people instantly into a pay rise under our genuine living wage. And we've also talked about how we'll get people back into homes again. At the moment, there is so many families at the moment that are in temporary accommodation. So we have to fix some of these problems in the long term, but immediately we've set out proposals on how we can support families. It's not just one lever, but I think it's really clear, and we said it before we were elected, that our number one priority is if we cannot say where the money's coming from, we will not make unfunded spending commitments. And the Chancellor has been very clear about that. We said it before the election, and we're not going to change course now. Of course we want to tackle child poverty. The last Labour government did. We lifted 1 million pensioners and children out of poverty, and it will be this Labour government that will have to do the same again after 14 years of the chaos and decline under the Conservatives.
You have previously described that cap on child tax as obscene and inhumane. So how comfortable are you that, OK, there are limitations on finances, but the Labour Party is not prioritising lifting that cap right at the start of its time in government?
Well, look, I've been really pleased that the Labour Party put the breakfast clubs in primary schools for children, because actually, as a child who was in receipt of free school meals because of my parents' financial circumstances, I went to school hungry. You know, I was waiting till lunchtime thinking about that in my first lesson. So prioritising, because we know we can have the biggest impact on making sure that there's free breakfast clubs, is about alleviating some of the challenges that families face. And, you know, we will continue in the vein of making sure that a priority of the government is to tackle child poverty, but it's not just one lever. Now, I accept that it's abhorrent what the Conservatives have done over the last 14 years, putting more and more families under pressure. You know, I didn't visit a food bank when I was a child and my parents were on benefits. We've got working parents now having to visit food banks because their income isn't enough to feed their families, and that's a priority of the government, is to give people secure work, to grow the economy, to pay for public services and to alleviate some of the pressures that people face. But our fiscal rule is very clear and has to be, because when you lose control of the finances, you end up in a situation that Liz Truss put us in, and that's where people are paying more now for their mortgages and their cost of living has increased. OK,
but some of your Labour colleagues think that you should be prioritising this policy. There's even talk this morning that some of them might put down an amendment to the Queen's speech tomorrow to try to make the government do this. What do you say to them? They're not hearing you. They think it's abhorrent and they think you should deal with it.
Well, I accept that people are frustrated and want to, change a lot of things that the Conservatives have done over the last 14 years, but our inheritance is dire. The Chancellor will set out in the coming weeks more of the situation. She's asked all departments to give them the frank information about what's happened, but we've seen unfunded commitments, we've seen the situation, the crisis in our prisons, so we have inherited a really difficult situation. But all I would say is look at what Labour's history and what we do when we're in government. And, as someone who grew up in poverty, I am not prepared to leave office, after a Labour government where we haven't made those significant changes. And child poverty is an issue for us, and we're absolutely appalled that children haven't got beds to sleep in at night. This is the 21st century. This shouldn't be the situation we're in, but this is the inheritance that the Conservatives have left us, and we will continue to tackle those issues.
But how frustrating is it for you? I mean, you're talking about your own background, that you are now in government, you have the power to do something, and yet on this particular policy, you're not prepared to do it. How comfortable are you with that?
Well, look, you said we have the power to do something, and we are doing something. As I set out earlier, around making work pay, around tackling the situation in homelessness and people living in temporary accommodation, around the breakfast clubs. There's a number of things that will alleviate challenges for families straight away. But we can't do everything. We said that before the election was called, and we're continuing to say that. We will put child poverty absolutely centre of what we do. The Prime Minister has made that absolutely clear that he wants to lead this piece of work. So the Prime Minister himself is absolutely committed to making sure we alleviate child poverty. It's not just one lever. 14 years of Conservative failure has left us in this situation, and we will roll up our sleeves as we have for the last 10, 11 days, working really hard to turn the country around. And that has to be through growth, because we've got highest tax burden in history and we've got the lowest growth, and that's why the Chancellor set out in the last week what we need to do to get that growth, and devolution is part of that, and so is the planning reforms that sit under my department.
Just zooming out a bit, just looking at politics more widely, we've been reporting the last couple of days about the assassination attempt on Donald Trump in the United States. We've of course seen MPs murdered here in the UK in the last couple of years. Your colleague Lisa Nandy told us here on Breakfast yesterday that she thought this general election was the most toxic she had ever seen. You've talked in the past as well about being on the receiving end of toxic politics. What do you think can be done? What can you now do to try and remove some of that toxicity?
I think, look, over, decades, and we fought for the right to vote. Vote is a healthy part of democracy, and it's something that some countries in the world still don't have the right to exercise the democracy that we have. And I think we have to take a step back, and people have to understand that it was hard fought for, the democracy that we have. I'm incredibly proud of our democracy, and that is about voting in the ballot box. It's not about suppressing somebody's views, it's not about violence, and it's really getting that, what type of country and what type of world do we want to live in. And that's about, we can have difference of opinions and we can debate them robustly, and I do. But you can't intimidate people who are elected or who want to stand for office, because one of the things I'm concerned about is many times when I go into colleges and to schools and do talks, the one thing that the students always ask me about is how do I cope with the level of abuse that I receive. I find that sad that that is their question, because it worries me that people won't want to stand for office. And for a thriving democracy, we need people to stand for office, and we need people to uphold our democracy by making sure that people aren't intimidated, we don't see that violence, and that people can exercise their right to vote.
But there might be young people who heard you using the word scum about Tory politicians yourself, and having to apologise for that only a couple of years ago, who were also put off going into politics. I mean, how do you now, as Deputy Prime Minister, reflect on your own use of language and your own responsibility in this?
Well, you'll have seen at the time about how I dealt with that, and I apologise, but there was also inflammatory language across the board, including racist, homophobic and misogynistic comments made by the then Prime Minister, and I think it was wrong. I've said that I was wrong, and I've said that the Prime Minister was wrong, and I think we all have to reflect on that. But, the point is that violence, there's no place for violence and intimidation in our politics. Now, we can have robust debates and people can argue about the language that is used, but debate is a healthy part of our democracy, but violence and intimidation is not.
Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner, thank you for joining us here on BBC Breakfast this morning.
Thank you.